This week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, corporate board member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of the NYSE Governance Services, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show today. We are going to be looking at the topic of Audit Committee composition and structure. And joining me, and who better to talk about this topic than my guest today, Trent Gazzaway, who's the National Managing Partner of Professional Standards for Grant Thornton. And Trent, it is a pleasure to have you back again.
TK, I appreciate being here. You put on a top-notch show, and I've always enjoyed doing this.
Well, we got new digs now. We're overlooking the floor, even though we pretended that we were in the past. But this is our first chance to be out of the new studio, so it's a pleasure to have you with us. So, you know, it's been a while since we had a chance to discuss something like the committee composition or the structure. A lot has happened, okay, that would lead us to at least give some thought to that process. So I have two questions for you. The first is, do you think it's still prudent to only have one financial expert on the audit committee these days? That's all that's really required. And two, how do we handle the representation on the committee with the new advent of risk related to cyber risk and data security? So let's first start with the financial expert, which I think is a good debate.
Well, I think when we talk about the financial expert requirement, I think the first thing we have to do is talk about why the audit committee exists in the first place. And its job is to oversee the financial reporting process of the issuer. There's a lot that goes with that. And I'll also say that the definition of a financial expert is pretty loose. You don't have to have a lot of accounting knowledge or necessarily even financial reporting knowledge to qualify as a financial expert. And I think it would behoove audit committees, especially audit committees of companies that have complex financial statements, to really focus first and foremost on getting talent that really does understand the intricacies of the accounting and financial reporting requirements, even if they just have one financial expert. The more complex a company's business and financial reporting are, I think the more important it is for them to explore possibly having more than one financial expert, because I think it's helpful to have a good balance of talent on the audit committee. You don't want the audit committee to be comprised entirely of technicians, but you do need at least one or maybe two technicians on the audit committee to really help ask the right questions of management, of internal audit, and of the external auditor to make sure that the financial reporting risks are being appropriately covered.
I was always in the camp that when people ask me about that I don't think you can go wrong by having two or even all three. And it takes the pressure off that if you have one financial expert,
right.
I mean, if I was that financial expert, I would want another set of eyes too. We're not talking about the easiest review here, you know, from the audit committee. And again, which we'll talk about next, especially with the advent of now cyber risk and data security being so big and unknown.
Right.
So, which is a great segue into our others. But so it's not a best practice, but you would also be in the camp that says it really can only help your audit committee to have experts.
I think so, and I think that there is an untapped pool of resources out there that do qualify as financial experts along the lines of what I was talking about. And that's retired accounting academics. They may not have had the run the business experience, but they clearly do have accounting and financial reporting experience, and they'll be able to ask some good questions. So I would encourage boards to really look at that pool of talent.
And today you're finding more and more academics that actually started in a business career, and that would be very valuable on that.
That's right.
So how about, you know, we've spent shows and shows talking about the risk of cyber cyber risk and data security. Does that sort of mandate that if you're going to be prudent, that you get somebody on the committee that has an understanding, assuming that you don't have a risk committee?
Well, I think when we look at the board's responsibility as a whole, its job is to make sure that you have the right composition of talent on the board. Cybersecurity is a major issue, and we could spend quite a bit of time talking about that. I don't know that the audit committee has to have somebody with cybersecurity experience, but the board certainly needs to consider that risk and make sure that it has appropriate talent on the board, and to the extent it's warranted, then having that talent participate in some audit committee meetings, because the audit committee does have to pay attention to cyber risk. And I think if the board has appropriate resources, one of the challenges that a lot of boards have is that most boards comprise people that have a lot of business experience and they understand business risk. But when we get a unique risk that comes along, very few board members and very few audit committee members have any experience in cybersecurity. And so it's very easy to miss some of the things and maybe not ask some of the right questions. So again, I think it behooves the board to have that talent. If they're not going to have that talent resident on the board, then I think they need to engage fairly frequently somebody with that talent to come in and advise the board.
Another question that comes up fairly often is the question about committee chair rotation, okay? It happens with all committees, but particularly with the audit committee. So what do you see, first of all, are you in favor of it? If so, how often? And then most importantly, what do you see out in the field these days as you go out and work with companies?
Well, I'll start with what I see. What I see is companies rotate sometimes for the sake of rotating. People just decide they're ready to do something different. I have a general business philosophy that suggests that it's good to rotate positions periodically, particularly leadership positions, probably every 5 to 8 to 10 years, just to get a fresh set of eyes. And I think that's probably true for most of the major committee positions. I think it's very easy to get, for a board and for an audit committee to get comfortable with certain people in certain roles for a long period of time, but that's not the board's job, it's not the audit committee's job. They're supposed to be challenging groups, and I think it's good to periodically rotate. Now, with that said, I wouldn't rotate just for the sake of rotation. I would make sure that we had qualified people. The chair's job is to make sure that the agenda is set right, that the right questions are being asked, that when difficult questions get asked, that there's follow-up to make sure that acceptable answers were received. And you can't just put anybody in that role. I think you need to pay attention to the talent. So the first thing I would do is make sure that my chair was qualified. If I had other qualified people that could fill that role, then I would, every 4 to 5 to 8 years, I would probably look to rotate that chair position. And if I didn't have enough talent that could rotate into that over time, then I'd be out looking for it.
Yeah, well, that gets back to our original on why you have more than one financial expert. At least that gives you the opportunity to have talent that potentially could handle the chair job as well. But yeah, we've both seen companies that rotate on an annual basis, and that I think is a real mistake, because you cannot learn any of the committee's chairman's job in just 1 year. So that would suggest that, okay, I'm not going to do it less than 3 years, but I probably agree that 5 years is a good number that somebody can learn the job enough to be effective, long enough for them to make an impact on their committee and on the board, and then for reasons of people getting too comfortable, it does make sense to rotate after that. So another sort of responsibility in this structure is for an audit committee to do a evaluation of the committee and the process and whatever. You look at everything from the charter to the duties of the chair and whatever, the performance of the chair, etc. Again, what do you see out in the field? And is there sort of a best practice on how one would handle their committee, audit committee evaluation?
Right. In terms of what I see in practice, it runs the gamut. I think it goes all the way from Very few boards and audit committees today aren't doing some sort of evaluation, even a self-evaluation. But I see them going all the way up to engaging experts to come in and do interviews and a lot of surveying and benchmarking and things of that nature. I would say that the least effective evaluations are where the board just sits around and asks itself a question, or the audit committee, how are we doing? I think the next stage of that is going out. There are a lot of governance organizations out there that have online tools and some checklists and some surveys that will help you ask yourself the right questions. I think when a board, when a company gets to a certain size or a certain complexity, or if the board feels like that things have become a little bit too stale, I think it's good periodically to bring somebody in from the outside that has some expertise in this area, that can ask the board and the audit committee some challenging questions and help benchmark. I don't know that every organization needs to every 3 or 4 years go through a full, robust self-evaluation, but I think every 5 to 10 years, actually probably more frequently than every 10 years, but it's good to get some experts in to really help you kick the tires and ask some difficult questions and get you to reflect a little bit. With the speed of business changing the way it is, I think boards and audit committees need to be more nimble. And I think some good self-evaluations and some external evaluations can help them do that.
When we talk about board evaluations for the whole board on the show, we have always said that we believe that at a minimum of every 3 years, you should have somebody from the outside, a third party, come in and do that. I understand why you wouldn't do that every year. A, because of cost. B, because it comes so fast. I mean, you finish an evaluation, next thing you know, it's time to do another one. So there may not be a necessity to do a full-blown,
exactly,
every year. But if you don't periodically go to the outside, sometimes when you're asking yourself or you're having your GC, serve in the role of doing that, it's too many insiders. There isn't anybody that can sort of cast that glance, from the outside. So, I think we're pretty much in the same camp as far as that works. Now, to close up here, I want to talk about, because I've heard you speaking recently as you're out and about and talking to directors and to senior management around the country. There seems to be a core message in your speech to audit committees about the need to use and communicate with all the resources that are available to them. For the benefit of our audience, sort of describe and define what you mean when you say use all the resources around you.
Well, I've said before, in fact, I think I've said on your show before, that being on an audit committee is a part-time job with full-time responsibility. And the only way to effectively execute that responsibility is to utilize the resources that you have. And audit committees really have 3 different resources. They certainly have management, and they can ask management a lot of questions and should be asking a lot of questions, and they can have management doing some research for them. They should, I would strongly encourage them to have an internal audit function. New York Stock Exchange listed companies obviously are required to have an internal audit function. And I think the internal audit can be the arms and the legs and the eyes and the ears of the audit committee. They're out in the organization. As long as they have enough autonomy to get their job done right, they're a tremendous resource for the audit committee. And then of course there's the external auditor. And so the audit committee kind of sits in the center of all of that, and they need to be coordinating independently with all 3 and collectively with all 3 to make sure that they're getting the same messages. In fact, I would encourage the audit committee to ask management and internal audit and external audit in separate settings some of the same questions and see what kind of answers they get and see if they can triangulate some of those answers. And I don't think, there are some audit committees that just don't take enough advantage of those resources that they have. They spend a lot of time with management. They listen to internal audit in a quarterly audit committee meeting, give a 20 or 30 minute presentation on what they've done. They do the same thing with the external auditor, and then they're done. I don't think they spend enough time really drilling down into what each group is doing, helping to direct each group, as resources, and then using that information to help them make decisions.
Yeah, well, that's great advice, and unfortunately we run out of time, so I'm going to ask you to come back next week, because we haven't talked about risk committees, we haven't really talked about the cyber risk, so those two in itself will create a fairly long conversation. So I hope that you can find it in your schedule to join us for that show as well. So that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We will be back again next week to cover a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. And we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton. And contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.